And of course, finally, I want to introduce our closing keynote, Esther Derby. We've wanted to have her here for many years, and it just never was in the cards. Schedule-wise, we could never make it work, and so we were so excited when it was going to work out this year. Many of you are probably familiar with her work, her book on retrospectives that she co-authored with Diana Larson. It's, I would say, the Bible of retrospectives. Do you want it to be called that? Yeah. Of how to run. It opens a lot of people's eyes about what retrospectives can be. Yeah. And she's going to talk to us a little bit about some of the things you've already heard and how you can take that back and increase the servant leadership that you offer at any level on your team. So please join me in welcoming Esther.
Thank you. All right, am I on? Can you guys hear me okay? All right, so I have to start by telling you that I'm recovering from a sinus infection. So I may start coughing. I'll take a sip of water and a cough drop, and that'll be a little annoying, but less annoying than listening to me cough. So I hope you'll bear with me if that happens. For those of you who don't know about me, I started my professional career as a programmer. How many programmers do we have in the room? Okay. If I told you my favorite language, you would know when I started my career as a programmer. So does anyone want to venture a guess? Assembler. It's like doing puzzles. It's just like doing puzzles. Yeah. Well, some things have changed a lot since then, and a lot of things haven't changed at all. So I started as a programmer, and over the years I've worn a number of different hats. I've done some testing, because we all used to do testing. We all used to test our own code, and that's coming back into fashion. I was a team lead. I was a manager, a dev manager. I was an internal consultant in a very large financial services company. And one thing that was clear to me from all of those perspectives, from all of those hats, was that our work environment has an enormous impact on our ability to be successful. So I really focus on creating environments and helping organizations create environments where people can do good work, where good work is the natural emergent property of the system. So that's really where I focus my attention. And one of the things I'm really passionate about is unleashing the potential for leadership at all levels in the organization. So I'm going to be talking about that. And I think you've heard a lot of things today and yesterday that are really apropos to that. The responsibility process is essential for leadership. You have to be able to take responsibility. Tim has talked a lot about curiosity and how that fits in. So these things all weave together in some ways. So I am not from Ohio. This is where I'm from. How many of you have heard of Duluth, Minnesota? Lovely, lively Duluth, Minnesota. I moved there 4 years ago because my husband thought Minneapolis was too hot. This is true. And Duluth, when it gets to 74 degrees, people start complaining. Oh, it's so hot, we're gonna melt. Oh my God, we need air conditioning. But people do ask how I can live there, and the answer is long underwear. That's the secret. I have 5 different weights of long underwear, and that's what gets you through the winter up there, that and taking up winter sports. It's the 17th largest port in the US. We get seagoing ships there, which, who knew? Surprising. Anyway, that's just where I live. And I work everywhere else. Never done any work in Duluth. It's okay. It's a nice separation in some ways. You know, people talk about work, life. On the other hand, I spend a lot of time on planes. But we're here today to talk about leadership. So I think we should start with kind of some traditional definitions of what leadership is. So these are very traditional. Leadership is simply causing other people to do what the leader wants. How many of you have ever worked for a leader who worked out of that philosophy? Anybody? Yeah, was it fun? No, not so much. Not so much. How about leadership is the process of encouraging certain behaviors via force of personality, persuasion, and eloquent communication. Anybody work for a manager or a leader like that? Yeah. It can be inspiring, right? Can be. How about leadership is the ability to inspire motivation in others towards a desirable vision? Anybody work for a leader like that? I don't see any hands. Okay, oh, one, way over there. Again, it can be inspiring. What about servant leadership, where the focus is primarily on the growth and well-being of the people and sharing power, putting the needs of others first, and helping people to develop? Anyone work with a servant leader? Yeah, there's a lot of talk about that now. I mean, people are using that as, you should be a servant leader. You should move forward with that. I think it's a move in the right direction. But all of these have something in common, which is they invest the power in one person, and they rely on either raw power and positional authority, charisma, inspiration, service, all invested in one person. And I think that leaves something out. I think that even with servant leadership, if it's only invested in one person, it's not going far enough. So many years ago, Kurt Lewin came up with this equation, which explains everything in organizations in an equation. Isn't that comforting? One equation sums it all up, which says behavior is a function of the person and the environment. Traditionally, we put all our focus on the person. In leadership definitions, it's all on one person. And I think we need to be paying attention to the environment and shifting our definition of leadership. So this is the definition I like. Leadership is the ability to enhance the environment so that everyone is empowered to contribute to creatively solving problems. So how does that definition feel? As Tim pointed out, we're doing knowledge work. We're not working with widgets. We're not manufacturing. We are not doing a predefined process. We are doing work that really relies on us bringing our best problem solving and our best thinking to bear every day. And in order to do that, you have to create the environment where that's possible. Now, as Tim also mentioned, we have a legacy. And part of that legacy is the separation of head and hands, which predates the Industrial Revolution, but it really came to the fore in the Industrial Revolution, where the people who were owners and managers did the thinking, they designed the systems, and then the workers carried out the work according to instructions. Along with that legacy, we have this idea that organizations are just vast machines. This is the legacy of mechanistic thinking. And in some ways, if your organization is a factory, if it's a mill where people are making textiles, this sort of makes sense because the jobs had to fit the machines. But that's not the work we do, right? We do no longer do work where every job can be deconstructed and decomposed into discrete tasks that can be specified and proceduralized and carried out. This may have been appropriate at one time. It was a huge advance in thinking about how to bring goods to people at a time when people had lived in really great material poverty. And you could argue that maybe what we have now isn't a great improvement, but it did bring material well-being into many people's lives. So it's not a horrible thing. It's not appropriate to what we have now. Now, these two things, separation of head and hands, thinking, doing, and thinking of organizations as vast machines, have led to a sort of model hierarchy in organizations where At the very top, you have leaders who set strategic direction. In the middle, you have leaders who order work, they direct, they control, they monitor activities. And at the bottom, you have people who are actually doing work at the direction of others. They're doing activities as directed. Now, this sort of management fosters a management style of telling. So telling people what to do. And when it gets softened a little, it's selling. So we're going to try to sell people on this. We're trying to gain their buy-in by selling them on the fact that this is a great idea. And when those things don't work, they resort to yelling. So selling, telling, yelling. And really, in some ways, that's what you can do when the people at the top are doing all the thinking and the people at the bottom are just supposed to do. You tell them what to do, soften it up, you sell them that it's a good idea, and if that fails, you yell. And when things go wrong, well, then it's the blame flow. And the blame flows throughout the organization from the top on down. How many of you like to be told what to do? Anybody raising a hand? I like to be told what to do when I am in a whitewater canoe situation and we've just hit some real rapids. Then I really like it when my husband says, "Pry, draw," because my life is at stake and I'm not very good at canoeing. So I like it then. But most of the time, most people don't really like to be told what to do. It's just sort of human. So what would happen if people at all levels in your organization had the ability to enhance the environment so that everyone was empowered to learn and contribute to solving the problems? What would happen? Let's sit with this for a while and we'll think about it. Some things that I know are going to happen is that we're going to move from top-down authority, which relies on positional power and the power of rewards and incentives, towards referent authority and expertise authority. That people have power, which I define as the ability to get needs met, because people respect them, they respect their past decisions, they respect their knowledge, they trust them, they know that they are benevolent, as Tim said, they have some benevolence. You're going to move from certainty to a situation where you have to observe and adapt. Now, there are still some situations in most companies where things are still certain. We need to be certain about our accounting practices. For example, see what happened with Enron when they were not so certain about their accounting practices. So there are some areas that are still can be predictable and certain. But for many parts of our organization, and particularly those parts where we're doing knowledge work, we have to rely on observation, seeing what is, testing our observations against an explicit model, and then taking action to adapt. We have to move away from the idea that there's one right way to do things and the people at the top know what it is, to emergent practices that are owned by the group. We need to move from relying so much on individual ability towards group ability and group capacity through learning and adapting. We have to move from centralized decisions that are made at the top and then flow down, to bounded autonomy. So we know that some things are going to change. Now, one thing about change is that when people come in with a new idea, which they think is better, they always tell you the upsides of it, right? They try to sell you on the upsides of it. And in change situations, when people only tell us about how wonderful it's going to be, on some level, we know that they're not being entirely truthful. Because we all know that change also brings loss. So this brings a sense of loss to many people when you start moving away from traditional models of leadership, traditional leadership philosophies, towards a philosophy that says everyone can be a leader, no matter where they are in the organization, because they can adapt their environment so that everybody can contribute more creatively. So some people feel a loss of control or perceived control. They may feel a loss of identity. You know, I was the one in charge. I was, you know, in control. I knew how to get things moving in this company. Some people feel a loss of meaning. It's like, you know, I used to have 20 people reporting to me and I told them what to do and I was on top of things, right? So for a lot of people, there is a sense of loss in this. And you have to acknowledge that. You have to acknowledge that there is going to be a loss here. There's also an upside in that management where you have to rely on one people or a small group of people actually puts a huge burden on people. Puts a huge burden on people. This lightens the burden. You know, it doesn't remove responsibility, but it shares responsibility, right? And it makes it possible for other people to improve ideas. So there's, with everything, an upside and a downside, right? And some people are going to feel lost about this. Now, I run into a lot of middle managers in particular who feel like if I'm not directing a team and telling my team what to do, if I'm not making decisions all the time, what's my purpose? Where do I fit in? And I actually think there's a hugely strategic role for managers when they are freed up from that day-to-day supervision, right? They can be looking across the system and improving the entire system. They can be developing people. They can be understanding how work flows through their organization. They can be looking at what are the impediments that are getting in the way of us delivering value to our customers. So there's a hugely strategic role for people. But you also have to acknowledge that, yeah, there is a loss in something that worked, for some definition of worked, and has been valued and valuable, and has brought people respect for many years in their careers. There's a couple things we have to look at if we want to actually move in this direction. There are some things that hold the current pattern in place. If we want to move towards a new way of leadership, we need to look at what holds the current model of leadership in place. And part of that is the bifurcation of knowledge in organizations. This is true of almost every large organization I've been in, but I've seen it start in organizations at about 20 to 30 people. So this happens when the people at the top of the organization have all the contextual knowledge. They know in detail and very deeply what business we're in, how we're positioning our product in the market, what our product does, what customer segment we're aiming for, what kind of relationship we have and we want to have with our customers, what are our channels, how do we make money. They know all of that stuff. And the people at the bottom know how to get stuff done on a day-to-day basis. You know, who do we need to talk to grease the skids? How do we work around this procedure? How do we, overcome this obstacle? They know all that stuff, but they may not understand the contextual stuff. Typically, there's an overlap, which is that yellow diamond. Very often, those are the middle managers. And in most organizations, that overlap is pretty small. Now, this is both a cause and an effect, this bifurcation of knowledge, and it leads to a lot of unhelpful dynamics. It leads to dependency, and it stifles initiative. I talked to a CEO recently who said, I just can't find good people to hire anymore. When I was starting this company, I found people who really got it, and we worked together, and they understood where we were going, and they took initiative. They knew what to do, and they would just do it. And I can't find people like that anymore. And I suspect there were actually a lot of people like that in his company, but they didn't have the knowledge to take initiative without doing something stupid, right? I think he probably had a lot of people like that, but because of this bifurcation, they could not act without taking huge risks, right? So they waited to be told, right? And the less they attended to that bifurcation of knowledge, the more extreme that problem became. So people became dependent, they lacked initiative, which caused the people at the top to think poorly of them, and it just eroded trust and respect. It creates unreasonable and unfair expectations. I mentioned earlier that when leadership is shared and distributed, it reduces the burden. This model, when there's this bifurcation, it puts a huge burden on managers. Huge. They have to know everything. They have to have all the answers. They have to be right because the stakes are so high. That's a burden. And really, no one can have all the answers, right? No one can have all the knowledge. Managers are working in ambiguity all the time. But when there's this bifurcation, that's the expectation, right? People wait to be told. Managers feel burdened. Both sides feel resentful. Both sides look stupid to each other. When I was working in financial services, this was when hedge funds were starting to become more popular, and we had a funds accounting system that did not account for options. So we were doing some programming to do that, and it was kind of tricky, you know, puts and calls. It was a little tricky, and so one of the programmers said, "Well, why don't we just tell the fund managers not to do that anymore? Why don't we tell them not to trade options?" Which sounds stupid and foolish, right? But it was because she lacked the contextual knowledge. She didn't understand that she was a really good programmer, but she didn't understand the domain. She had to be told what to do in specifications because she didn't understand how the business ran. On the flip side of that, one of the fund managers asked me why he couldn't just speak his orders into the computer, which he could do now, but we were talking green screen. Anybody remember green screens? Yeah, a few, yeah. So he appeared really unrealistic and disconnected. You know, why is it taking so long? It's just a database. You know, so it leads to all of these unhelpful dynamics. And it makes people look stupid and feel stupid, and it erodes trust. You know, they don't know what they're talking about up there. Or they don't understand how this could possibly take more than a week, right? Or why are these people making stupid decisions? They should know that this would get in the way of our making revenue. Well, it's because the knowledge is bifurcated. So this is one of the first things we need to do if we want to have leaders at all levels, is we need to make the diamond bigger. And who doesn't like bigger diamonds? Right? Make that diamond bigger. So expand the overlap of knowledge in your organization. That doesn't mean that all of your executive suite needs to know how to write code. It doesn't mean that all the programmers and the service desk people and everybody else needs to know how to develop a profit and loss statement, but they do need to know what business are we in, what product are we making, who are our customers, what are they like, how does our product fit into their work life. And the people at the top need to know what's our real capacity. What is their capacity to actually develop the products that we need to bring to market? I mean, I'm sure someone in this room must have had the experience of a manager promising something that was way beyond the capability of your organization. Has that ever happened to anybody else? Yeah, where there's some promise made that is far beyond the capability of the organization to deliver it. So they need to understand that. They have to have some understanding and respect for the work that's done. That increases the diamond. So, if we go back to this, which is the opposite of empowering, this telling, yelling, and selling, we need to have a different way to think about how we are going to manage in complexity and how we're going to think about those concerns in our organization. Because it's not like those concerns go away, they just get handled in a somewhat different way. So I think about them as domains versus levels. So you have a steering domain, which says, as an organization, this is where we're headed. This is where we endeavor to be in our market. These are the customers we want to have. This is the relationships we're going to be having with them. This is where we're making money. These are what just steers the big old organization. And these decisions typically don't change frequently, right? In startups, they may change more often, but as organizations grow, they tend to change a little at a slower pace. And you may change a product, but you may not change your entire market. You may not change why you're in existence. So these are steering concerns. The enabling domain has to do with how do we actually get work to flow through our organization in a way that enables people to work effectively without having to struggle, without having a billion hurdles, so that we can deliver product to our customers in a time frame that makes sense for their needs and for our needs, right? So I think about these three domains: steering, enabling, and doing. It may look like it's hierarchical. It doesn't have to be. I know of several companies where everybody is involved in all of these decisions. It's completely flat. Completely flat. Everybody does steering, everybody does enabling, everybody does the doing and delivering. And they're all involved in that. That's not typical, but this model accounts for those sorts of decisions no matter what size of your company you may be in. You may have divisions that each do some subset of this or some iteration of this, but these concerns are always present. And within each, you pay attention to three things, which are clarity, conditions, and constraints. This is how you manage in complexity: clarity, conditions, constraints. And I'll talk about each one of these. Clarity means that people know what to work on, they know how their work fits in the big picture, they understand the contextual knowledge. So this plays out a little differently in each domain, right? But this is what you need to work with in order to create an environment where you can have leaders at all levels. People need to know what to work on, how it fits in. Now, very often when I go to a technology company and I ask people, what product do you make? Or what does your product do? They give me an explanation that is the software equivalent to this. Well, okay, how does electricity made? First we mine some coal, and then it gets refined, and then it gets burned, So they give me this very, very long technical explanation. But they can't really tell me what problem are we solving, what benefit are we creating for what group of people. So how many people could answer that question for me off the top of their head for your product or your company? What problem are we solving, what benefit are we creating for what group of people? How many people could answer that? Some hands, yes, some hands. A lot of people can't. How many of you were in, I don't want to pronounce his name wrong, outcomes over outputs? How many of you attended that talk? Anybody? Yeah, so he was talking about this problem that people didn't know really who used their product or what happened to it after they finished writing their code. So it was one of the groups I was working with. I asked them, I went over to the light switch and I said, okay, I turned off the lights and I said, okay, I'm going to flip this switch. The lights are on. What's possible now? And they told me a bunch of things. Oh, I can see my papers. I can write. I can just so. And then I said, tell me about your product as if it was flipping on this light switch. What's possible for people when they have your product that wasn't possible before? What can they do if their product is installed on their device or running their company on their, whatever it is. What can they do that they couldn't do before? That's the level at which you have to be able to describe your product in order to have clarity, right? So that talks about product clarity. You also need to know what to work on in what order so that work flows smoothly. You have to have some sense of what agreements you have in your team, what you're working on this day, what your stories are about, who's working on them, who are they for. This flows through all the levels. What problem are you solving? What benefit are you creating for which group of people? And that question is recursive. You answer it over and over and over again. You need to have the conditions and the means for people to actually do their work. And you have to have organizational structures that support them. How many of you feel like you're really well supported to do your work in your organization? Oh, okay, so that's like maybe half a dozen hands over there. How many hands over here? Yeah, a few hands. This gets in, this is a fundamental thing, that if people don't feel like they have the means to do their work, it's very hard for people to be engaged, right? It's very hard for people to feel like they should care very much. And at some point, it can feel like abuse. Right? I worked on a project once where it was taking an enormous amount of time to compile the code because we had such memory issues on our machines, and we asked for more memory. We were working on the most important project in the company, and we wanted memory that was going to cost $100 per machine. What do you think they told us? We can't afford it. So, what do you think that did to us? You think it was motivating? No, it was just the opposite of motivating. Because on one hand, we're hearing, this is the most important project for the company, and we can't afford $800. That's going to save you guys several hours every day. Yeah, and when there's a gap like that, it fills in with cynicism and fear. It's certainly cynicism, right? So creating the means and the conditions for people to do their work is really essential. Now, on the team level, how many of you work with teams? I would guess just about everybody in this room works with a team or is on a team. Yeah, on a team, that means that you have a compelling goal that everybody understands. They have a shared understanding of it. That you're a real team, not a revolving door, where the membership changes every few weeks. I talked to somebody a couple of weeks ago when I was in Sweden that she said, I have a new team every day. Well, she really didn't have anything resembling a team. What she had was a group of people that anytime somebody who was noticeably competent came into that group, someone else would poach them for another project. So she essentially didn't have anything resembling a team. She had X number of people who were randomly assigned to this project at any given time. So she didn't have anything that even resembled a real team. I talked to another guy who called me because his team was not very motivated. They weren't very motivated. So I asked him some questions. And it turned out that they worked in a basement room with no windows, and their job was updating policy pages for a large bank. Does that sound compelling? No, it didn't sound compelling to me either. So I kept asking him questions about these things, do they have information about how their work fits in? Well, Then they just research and update the policies. I said, well, do they have support? You know, do they have access to other people? Nope, they have to do all the research on their own. They have a bunch of manuals and they look things up and they read statutes and they update it. So do they have access to people who can help them with that? Do they have, you told me they work in this basement room. Do they have other kind of material support? Well, no, because this is not high priority work, they don't get really great machines. They kind of get the second-hand ones. And I said, well, what about having a connection to the organization? Are there people who really care about the work they're doing? I mean, it's a bank. You'd think people would care about this. And they said, well, it takes them a while to work on one of their web pages, and then they go to the person who's listed as the owner, and sometimes that owner has changed, and so then they have to find the next owner, and then it may take them 3 or 4 weeks to find the new person who's in charge of that page, and then that person generally says, oh, well, we'll get to it in 6 months. So they didn't have a lot of information. They didn't have much material support. They had this horrible basement room. They didn't have access to help. Nobody in the organization seemed to care about what they were doing. So it became quite clear why they weren't very well motivated. They didn't have the conditions to actually function as a team. So you need a goal that makes some sense. You need to have an actual real team, which means generally small in size, shared goals, shared accountability, some history, some agreements on how to work together, shared approach, right? So they didn't have any of those things. So it wasn't surprising to me that they weren't working really well. And at that point, the guy said, well, I can see that giving them a pep talk isn't going to help. I agreed with him. Not being unmotivated was a completely rational response to the conditions they were in. So you have to have the means. Clarity, people know what to work on. Conditions, they have what they need to do the work. And then they need constraints. So if you're familiar with theory of constraints or lean, constraints may have kind of a bad connotation for you because there are constraints that limit flow. I'm talking about constraints in the sense that constraints dampen flailing. If you have a completely blank page, sometimes it's really hard to start, right? If you don't know what the boundaries are, sometimes it's really hard to know where to go. Like, we can go on vacation anywhere. How do you decide? So these are the kind of constraints that dampen flailing so that people know what should always be done and what should never be done. Tim talked about that in terms of, what is prohibited and what is discouraged, what is actively encouraged and permitted and allowed. They know what their bounded autonomy is. So they know I can make decisions here, but if I go over there, if I step too close to this line, I need to have a conversation. Now, most organizations handle constraints with policies. How many of you have policies at your organization? Yes. Well, I'm not saying get rid of policies. There are some policies you have to have, particularly if you're a bank, right? You want policies that govern fiduciary responsibility. You want policies around harassment and respectful treatment and things like that. So I'm not saying get rid of policies, but what generally happens in organizations is that people try to anticipate every situation that might come up or every mistake that someone might make, and then they put a policy in place for it. And you end up with something like poor Mr. Gulliver, where he's completely tied down by all these tiny little threads, none of which individually would hold him down, but the sheer number of them pinned him to the ground. If you have an organization like that, the only way to get anything done is to break the rules. I don't think that's such a good message to send, particularly if you're a bank. Right, or you're a regulated industry, right? So these policies get put in place over time. They just pile on and pile on and pile on, very often in response to a specific incident. So I worked once, I consulted to a call center. They had about 1,000 people working in a call center, and it was in the metropolitan area. It was in Minneapolis. And this was in the days before Uber. So people drove to work, or they took the bus to work mostly, since they were, not terribly well-paid people. And most of the time they went home before the buses stopped running. But your manager could come up to you and say, with 15 minutes notice, I need you to work an extra shift. And the policy was that if your manager asked you to stay late, then you could take a cab home if the buses were no longer running. Well, we won't talk about the idea of 15 minutes notice to work an extra shift. We'll just leave that story for another time. And it seems sort of reasonable that people should be able to take a cab home if the buses weren't running. That doesn't seem like such a bad policy, does it? Well, one night, a couple of people were working late, and the buses were no longer running when they finished their work, when they finished their extra shift. And it was really late, and they were really tired. And they stopped at the bar across the street and had a bump before they went home, before they got in the cab. That doesn't sound so bad, does it? That sounds like sort of reasonable. I mean, especially taking a cab after you've had a couple of bumps. Well, the vice president found out about this, and she was displeased. She said, I did not authorize you to take a cab from the bar. You can only take a cab from the building. And from now on, anyone who wants a petty cash reimbursement over $5 will need my personal approval. Is that a good use of management time? Not really. But again, we're going to leave that story for another day. But what her policy did was it communicated very clearly, we don't trust you to make a good decision about even $5, right? So she immediately, through this policy, communicated her distrust for an entire department, right? And when organizations do this, the people who are subject to these policies almost always find a way to get back. Almost always find a way. I was reading a study the other day about a company, it was a milling company where people felt that they were not being treated respectfully by their managers, so they would pilfer parts. They would just take a few things home, and because it was a union shop, if anyone mentioned it, they would flood HR with union complaints, so the management couldn't do much about it. Without getting involved in a whole union issue. And there were people who had like entire garages full of parts because they'd been pilfering for years. Just to get back at management because they felt they weren't being treated very well. I'm not saying that's a morally acceptable choice, but it happens. In that particular company, management finally decided that punishment wasn't working, so they created a parts library so people could borrow parts and tools and stuff. And then they had an amnesty. and they got back like whole machines, that had been created. And it went on for weeks and weeks and weeks as people emptied out their garages, and all the wives were so happy because the garages were empty. So, but this is what happens, right? People make policies in response to a particular incident or to try to prevent some future event from happening, and people either end up tied down like Gulliver. They have to break rules or they end up feeling resentful because they know they're not being trusted. And in truth, in a complex situation, you cannot anticipate everything that will happen. You need to create a situation where people can use their brains to make good decisions because they have clarity, because they have the conditions, and they have some set of simple rules or heuristics that will guide actions, interactions, and decisions across a broad array of situations. So in complexity, you cannot anticipate everything, so you have to have broad rules that are widely applicable. Now, this comes from a company in California, and their heuristics are always team over individual, department over team, company over department. So that guides their decision making, and it makes sure that everybody is always optimizing for the company as a whole, not sub-optimizing for my department or my team. So these heuristics guide people, and they create a sort of boundary, right? We know that we should always test our decision this way. We know, right? Without being told or bound by all sorts of very detailed rules. Now, the other part of this has to do with who gets to make decisions. I worked with a company, which shall remain nameless, where I worked with the managers about which decisions could be done by teams. It was a company that prided themselves on hiring the best and the brightest. We have really, really smart people here. The managers felt really burdened. They were always frantically busy. So I was working with them to figure out, how many decisions can be delegated to teams. So most of the groups I worked with, when I said, okay, let's make a pile of decisions that have to stay with management, either for fiduciary or legal reasons. Let's make a pile of decisions that can be shared with the team. You need to be involved in it, but the team is involved in some way, either by making recommendations or by having a vote in it, or a number of ways they can participate, but there's some level of sharing. And then there's the decisions that the team can make, as long as they have some boundaries around it. As long as they know, if it's over $10,000, then we have to come talk to you, something like that. So most of the groups, they had a smallish pile here, they had a medium-sized pile here, and they had a big pile of decisions that if they identified proper constraints, they could delegate to the team. So if we tell them, as long as this tool that you want to use is within this price range and it meets these criteria, you can choose whatever tool you want. And here's your training budget. As long as your training fits in one of these big buckets, that it's related to your technical skills, your collaboration skills, something around the domain, something around the market, and something relevant to the team, you can go. You don't have to ask us permission, right? This is your training budget, right? As long as you have those constraints, you can delegate those. There was one group that felt they could only delegate maybe 3 decisions to the team. They could choose their own team name from an approved list of Mexican wrestler names. They could make their own working agreements, and they could choose how to spend their snack budget. I think they were over-constrained. And it really communicated that this group didn't have much trust for these extremely bright, we hire only the best people. So I asked them, well, why can't the team make more decisions? They said, well, they don't have the contextual knowledge. So there we are, back to the diamond. That's what we worked on, make the diamond bigger. How do we make that diamond bigger so the teams have the knowledge so that they can make these decisions, and you guys don't have to run around frantically. So you can spend your time on more important stuff. So how many of you are curious about this picture? Anybody curious about this picture? Okay, I'll tell you. So I said the team needs to know what their boundaries are. Right? They need to know what their bounded autonomy is. And in many, many organizations, people aren't used to thinking about it that way, so they don't. And then this phenomena happens. to the people in the organization. But I use this little drawing to illustrate it because it sticks in people's minds. I have some neighbors, bless their hearts. Do you guys say bless their hearts here? Yeah, okay, bless their hearts. I have some neighbors, bless their hearts, who have an electric fence. Or, you guys know what electrical fence for dogs is? That you have a wire buried under the ground, and it has an electrical current running through it, and the dog wears a collar. And so if the dog gets too close to the wire, gets a shock. Of course, living where I live, it does not keep the coyotes out, does not keep the foxes out, does not keep the neighborhood bear out, but keeps the dogs in. Well, they, when they moved in, they thought, oh, we're going to cut down all the trees and we're going to make a garage in a few years, so we don't want to bury the fence yet because we'll just have to dig it up. So their invisible electric fence is on the ground. And when the wind blows, it moves. And those dogs now won't get within 10 feet of the boundary of the yard because they have, and it's different every day. It's different every day where that wire is. So they, I mean, if they had this whole yard, they'd like be standing here. Don't want to move. Bless their hearts. But this happens in organizations all the time, right? Where some well-intentioned manager will say, I get this empowerment thing. I get it. We have smart people. We need to let them make more decisions. And so they say, you're empowered. Go make a decision. And the team, lacking contextual knowledge and not knowing where the boundary is, they make a decision and then they get, or slapped. They get slapped in some way. So it's super important to have these be clear. Not like they're in iron, not like it's a wall that can't be scaled, but you have to have some conversation to articulate it so that when people know they're getting close to the boundary, we better have a decision. We better have a conversation about this decision. Because we think that the best option is actually right over here. But because our boundary's here, we're going to have a conversation. Right? And there are cases where making a decision that is slightly more expensive is worth the extra expense. I just did a kitchen remodel. I could have done it for, X amount of dollars, but 1.1 times X got me a much better kitchen. I was willing to do that. We had that conversation. So sometimes that happens. So it's not like you can't ever go over it. It's there, you can have a conversation. And the fact of having that initial conversation about where the boundaries are establishes that on a meta level. That, we're not sure about this. Let's go have a conversation. Let's talk about what the boundaries are. What's the budget? What's the impact implications? Where do we need to make this? Where do we need to make this boundary? So that we can have not chaos, not stupid mistakes, not idiocy, but bounded autonomy, right? And we don't have that situation where the managers are saying, we want you to be empowered, and the teams are standing there saying, well, we've never made a decision like this before, and last time they said we were empowered, they didn't really mean it, so what are they going to do? And the manager's standing over here saying, you're empowered, make a decision. And the team's standing over here saying, well, not so sure, not so sure. Until the manager says, damn it, if you won't decide, I will. I just swore, sorry. Second time today. So, anyway, I won't repeat the other one. So this is what you need to pay attention to. Clarity, conditions, and constraints. And they play out slightly differently at the steering domain, the enabling domain, and the doing domain. But these are the primary levers we have for managing in complexity and for creating a situation where people are always able to learn and where people can be leaders, no matter what their level. So we think about leadership as this really big thing, inspirational vision, persuasion, force. But leadership is actually just creating an environment where everybody can contribute creatively. Even the most junior programmer can be a leader. I was in a meeting where there was a junior programmer, and the team was arguing about something, and they were going around in circles. And he finally said, I'm not sure what we're talking about. Can we write down the options? And he got a marker, and he started, writing down the options. That was leadership. That was leadership from the most junior, newest guy on the team, because he adapted their environment by writing on the whiteboard so that everybody was more clear about the options they were discussing, and everybody could contribute better to solving that problem because they weren't going in a circle anymore. This is possible at all levels in acts large and small that contribute, that help people feel engaged, that help people feel more agency, like we're no longer dependent, we're no longer waiting. We know what our boundaries are, we know what we're supposed to do. We can do this. Fostering the ability for people at all levels to contribute creatively is in of itself a huge and powerful act of leadership. This is the sort of thing that changes the way people feel about their work, feel about themselves. They can bring more of their intelligence and their creativity to bear on what's happening. And you have to get there by making the diamond bigger and then paying attention to clarity, conditions, and constraints. Now, some people say, how is this possible with a hierarchy? It's completely possible. You just have to remember that the original purpose of any hierarchy is to help the originating subsystems do their jobs better. The purpose of every level of hierarchy isn't the accretion of power and privilege. It's to reduce the cognitive overload and to make it easier for the originating level to do their work more effectively. If you've ever worked in a startup, the reason they bring in managers is because there's coordination overhead and communication overhead. So it's getting in the way of people doing their work. It's to make it easier for people to do their work. And that's your job. That's your job as a leader or a manager, is to create environments where everyone can be a leader by improving their environment, no matter what their level. Junior programmer, and on up. Over time, you'll notice that people are making better, and you're having better and faster decision making because people can make good decisions. They have the knowledge, they have the boundaries to do that. You'll have greater organizational flexibility because people will develop their skills. They'll have greater understanding of your overall organization. You'll have vastly increased engagement because people will feel like it's theirs. They have some agency. They're able to bring themselves to work. They no longer feel like they're tied down by a thousand threads of policies. And you'll have a vastly reduced need for supervision, which means managers, you can go do the really interesting and strategic stuff. And you may find that people love their work again. And that's something I think we can all work for. So, in my quest, my never-ending quest to even out the number of cute kitten pictures in the world, I have a cute dog picture. And I think I have some time left for questions. Is that accurate? Yep. So, you can look at my cute dog while you think of a question. She's a French bulldog. She's in charge. I live to serve her. She's not in jail in this picture, by the way. She's looking through the banister. So who has a question? Okay.
Hello, I was just looking for more of a philosophical justification for the theory that you are working from, because we've been talking about distribution of knowledge, empowerment of the employees, the impact of the culture on the worker, and they have all been developed by likely neo-Marxist thinkers who don't think that big corporations have anything to say with that. They think that they are by nature doing the opposite. So I wonder if we can expect the employee to be motivated by clarity, condition, and constraint without rewards and compensation.
So I had a little trouble hearing what you were asking. So I think what you're asking is, how can you do this without rewards and compensation?
I was just saying that basically the distribution of knowledge, empowerment have all been developed by neo-Marxist thinkers, which are fundamentally opposed to big corporations. We have it. So I'm thinking, like, how can we have them both in one place, right?
Well, I'm not going to get into a theoretical discussion of neo-Marxist philosophy here. If you want to try that offline, we can do that. A lot of my thinking comes out of complexity science. Gerald Weinberg's work, Virginia Satir's work, but the clarity, conditions, and constraints really comes out of complexity thinking. How many of you have heard of Margaret Wheatley? You guys know about Margaret Wheatley? I see one hand going up. She's an organizational researcher, and I heard a little interview with her where she said, we have known since the 30s that self-management, which involves leadership, self-leadership, and leadership at all levels, vastly improves productivity. It vastly improves productivity. There were studies done in coal mines in Wales where the conditions got so bad in the mines that the managers would no longer go in. And what do you think happened to productivity? It went up. It went up. Because the teams at the coalface were figuring out, how to best organize their work, who should be doing what. Patty had too much to drink, we don't want him doing the blasting. So we've known for a long time that that self-management and self-organization improves productivity. Many people are reluctant to give up control, and they would prefer to have control over productivity. And rewards is one way that we control people. It's a form of power, which, if you look at the sources of power, you have coercion, you have reward power, you have positional power, which is position power related to being a manager, whatever. The best you can hope for with those three forms of power is compliance. But if you rely on referent power, you rely on expertise power, you tend to get buy-in, right? So compensation has to be there. And I am guided by Peter Schulte's thinking on that, which is you pay people a fair wage so they feel like they're being compensated fairly, and then that takes it off the table, right? Differential pay has enormous implications for disengagement and people feeling treated unfairly. So I hope that addressed some of what your question was related to, but we'll have to take up the neo-Marxist philosophy at another time. Okay? All right, who else? Okay. Anybody else seeing a question? Well, let's face it, I'm between you and the drinks. So, there is another question?
Hello. Just a quick announcement that we still have that set of lost keys at the information desk. If you drive a Jeep, we have your keys.
Okay, so
Goodbye.
and you need your keys to get to the drinks. So one more slide, which is my contact information. I'd love to talk about this stuff, and it's always a little different when you try this out in the real world than it is in a talk. So if you have questions, I have a phone and I know how to use it. Email me, we'll find a time to talk. I love to talk about this stuff. I also do an occasional, roughly monthly, free Ask Me Anything sort of, well, it's not actually an Ask Me Anything, it's a topic-specific Q&A where I'll share some insights and ideas about something and then I'll open up. Then you can ask me any question about that topic. So if you want to get an invitation to those, you can sign up on my website and then you will be invited to all of them until you tell me you don't want to be invited anymore. You can also sign up for my newsletter. And yes? Is there a question?
I don't know.
Oh. I don't know.
I didn't. Oh yeah, thanks. He said it, not me.
I was utterly incapable of hearing that. I'm sorry. Can you translate for me?
He turned.
Sorry, Esther. He wanted to say thank you to everyone for coming, and thank you to you for speaking.
Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you for coming to my talk.
And one last thing. Everybody, cheer for chickens.
Is that an inside joke that I don't get? Oh, okay. Anyway, thank you for coming to my talk. It's been delightful. Retrospective, drinks, talent contest, yay.